Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, there is so much going on in the world today. When I say the world, I don't mean the entire globe, but the society that deals with athletics. Excuse me. One player named Tyreek Hill was stopped. He plays for the Kansas City Chiefs by a cop who'd had two, complaints about inappropriate stops and mistreatment of people. We have seen that there are some national cases, which I'm not going to go into detail on, but you know that your former president is a 4 times felony convict, and he whines, and everything is everybody else's fault. And he reminds me of that song by the Temptations, or well, anyway, not the Temptations, but they say, who's always running in the halls? Who's always writing on the walls? Who's always throwing spitballs? Yes, who? Who, me? Yes, you. He walks in the classroom, cool and slow. Who calls it to English? Teacher Daddy-O, Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown. He's a clown, that Charlie Brown. He's going to get caught, just you wait and see. And his line was Trump's, why is everybody always picking on me? No, he's like cotton, though. There's a lot of picking because a lot of picking is in store. Trump's running mate is the one who said that Haitians, black people, immigrants who are legally in a city called Springfield are eating the pets, the dogs and cats, which has caused such an uproar that schools had to be closed. There were bomb threats and all kind of nonsense such as that. But sports are really dominating the airwaves, so I decided I would talk about some things relative to athletics where I had some degree of involvement. But as an intro, there was an article written in the school newspaper, the university paper, and it said the following, and this was from 1997. Chambers doesn't always wait to be asked for help. If he sees problems, he steps in. In 1987, a grieving father in Ashland dug up the coffin of his 9-week-old daughter who had recently died of sudden infant death syndrome. He brought her to the hospital saying she was ill. The county attorney planned to charge him with illegal exhumation, which could have brought prison time and a $1,000 fine. See, he dug the infant up and took her to the hospital. Chambers wrote the county attorney saying, quote, he needs compassion, understanding, and perhaps treatment, but nothing will be gained by society or the man if he should be taken through a trial, convicted, and either imprisoned or fined. The county attorney reconsidered his decision and did not prosecute. There are things that happened on the university campus involving female athletes and even a coach that drew me into that sphere. And here is one item. This was from the Daily Nebraskan. February 21st, 1997. When NU women's basketball coach Angela Beck was offered a contract that awarded yearly salary increases based on attendance, Chambers sent an outraged letter to UNL's legal counsel. He said the contract equated Beck with ladies of the night, who must also bring in paying customers. Beck could increase attendance by dressing the players as Hooters girls, Chambers pointed out in the letter, but in the end, Beck accepted the contract. I have had some influence on what happened on that university. This is an article from 2001. NU coach changes mind, grants scholarship release. Nebraska men's basketball coach Barry Collier, perhaps with a nudge from State Senator Ernie Chambers, changed his mind Tuesday and granted a scholarship release to former player Kevin Augustine. I had always said those players are like serfs or semi-slaves. They're treated like property, they're misused, they are exploited, and not given anything in return. They can be dropped from the team and even removed from school at any time because so much of their time is spent on the field that their grades suffer due to the fact that they can't get up, stay caught up with the work. So they will be threatened with that. And under the NCAA rules, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, if a player had a scholarship at College A or University A, and he wanted to leave because he had a family matter at home and he wanted to enroll at a university in his hometown, then if the school he was attending did not release him as you release a slave from the plantation, he could not play at the other school, and the school could not allow him to come and get any assistance. That's what was happening with this player, Kevin Augustine. The move allows Augustine to play immediately. The coach released him in this instance. The move allows Augustine to play immediately at Biola University, a small NAIA school in Los Angeles, instead of sitting out 10 games, according to NCAA athletics transfer rules. Collier, the Nebraska coach, took heavy criticism on the issue last week from Augustine's father, Irby, who called the action punitive and, quote, sticking it to my 22-year-old son. Kevin Augustine left Nebraska for his hometown of Los Angeles in part to be closer to his mother, who suffers from colon cancer. Collier's initial response for withholding a release, quote, I would be rewarding Kevin for breaking a commitment and encouraging future players to walk out on their commitments, unquote. When asked Tuesday why he changed his mind, Collier said only, I just want to move on. Chambers of Omaha said Tuesday that he became upset about Collier's actions upon reading Saturday's story in the World Herald about Augustine. Quote, it is my responsibility as a person and as an elected official to exercise some oversight on a matter that deserves due process, Chambers said. Acting on his own, Chambers said he contacted an NU official about Augustine's situation and distributed copies of the story in Lincoln on Monday. That meant to the members of the legislature. Quote, without revealing any trade secrets, Chambers said, I was very blunt about how wrongful I felt the conduct was, and that if the coach was of the mind to be tough and punitive, those are concepts that I understand very well, but it would be best for everybody if it did not have to come to that point. I was told that given time, this issue could be worked out, and would I give it that time? I agreed. And as it turned out, continuing the article, Irby Augustine said at midday Tuesday he had not talked to Collier but learned of the release from the Biola coach. There are no winners in this situation, Irby Augustine said from Corona, California. There is no gloating on this end. We're just happy this has been resolved, and we wish everyone back there good luck and a good season. There are things that happen to these students, whether athletes or not, and when they are from far away, the college or university administrators know that they are unsure of themselves, they lack confidence, they may not even have a way to get back home right away, so they can be misused and abused. I didn't like to see that happen. And when I saw it, I didn't have to be invited. My sense of responsibility, especially as an elected official, impelled me to do the kind of things that I do. Now, there is a grant and aid that students would be allowed to have, but problems could arise. So I wanted to make sure that when this athlete had a grant in aid, he or she would keep it. So I got this law put on the books. No public post-secondary educational institution in the state of Nebraska shall, prior to graduation, reduce, cancel, or refuse to renew an athletic grant in aid to a student during his or her period of eligibility to compete in intercollegiate athletics solely because of an injury which prevents the student from participating in athletics. I found out that if a student was hurt, this grant in aid is called an athletic scholarship. They shouldn't put scholar on it because it has nothing to do with scholarship, but only athletic participation. So I put into the law a requirement that they not lift a scholarship because an athlete was injured. This article appears in the Kansas City Times. Legislator helped 2 regain aid. Gymnasts at Nebraska regain scholarships after legislator steps in. Scholarships, how binding are they? Guess who this legislator was? This is by Kent Pulliam on the sports staff of the Kansas City Times. Student athletes are not without their champions. In Nebraska, it is Ernest Chambers. In those days, they call me Ernest instead of Ernie. Ernest Chambers, a legislator who has sponsored legislation that would outlaw post-secondary schools in that state from revoking a scholarship because the athlete suffers an injury. Last fall, Chambers fought for the reinstatement of scholarships for 2 women gymnasts after they were revoked by the University of Nebraska. Janet Hollings and Renee Gould, then members of the Nebraska women's gymnastic team, each had a full scholarship when they suffered injuries during the 1985-86 school year. Their scholarships were not renewed. They were informed well within the time frame allowed by NCAA rules, but the action by gymnastics coach Rick Walton was in violation of a 1984 Nebraska law that prohibited reduction or cancellation of an athletic grant in aid solely because of an injury that prevents the student from participating in athletics. Before Holling was aware of her rights, the university negotiated a partial scholarship settlement. However, Chambers called for the Nebraska Attorney General's office to investigate, and after hearings last fall, a full scholarship was restored to Holling. According to Jean Crump, Deputy Attorney General, Gould said she did not want her scholarship back, and it was returned on the basis of that law that I mentioned before. Chambers, who became aware of the situation when it was reported in the university student newspaper, said he saw little merit in the defense advanced by Nebraska athletic officials. Their letter to Chambers admits that they violated the law, though they don't use the word violated, Chambers said. They finally said their findings were inconsistent with the law, but the result is what I am after. The Nebraska situation involved 2 athletes in a non-revenue sport, yet it underscored the vulnerability of student athletes and their rights. Neither young woman was aware of the state law protecting them. Neither was aware of the NCAA guidelines for a hearing and the ramifications it would have on her future involvement as a member of the team. Chambers said he was considering adding an amendment to the law that would require the school to inform athletes of their rights. Quote, "The thing that troubles me about this is that the people who the athletes need to trust most are the ones who violated that trust," Chambers said. "How can they teach our students ethics when the people those students are supposed to be looking to as an example lie and cut corners and take shortcuts? When they see that, they think that's the way to go." And this girl, the had re-injured a wrist during a meet and was able to continue on the team. The other never talked to her, said the coach never talked to her after her wrist injury. "It seemed to me that I was blamed that I got hurt," said Gould, who still is attending Nebraska. Toward the end of the year, they were holding team meetings without the two of us. Gould said she did not always get along with the coach and probably would not have returned to the Nebraska gymnastics team under any circumstances. That was why she did not appeal her loss of scholarship immediately. I didn't know anything about the law, Gould said. I thought getting back would mean having to go back on the team. Before the hearing with the Attorney General's office, the coach widely was quoted as having said, in both cases, it was cut and dry. They couldn't compete with the injury problems that they had. We had to open up the scholarships and bring in new people. That put him immediately in violation of the law. Holling learned that her full scholarship had been restored when her parents heard it on the news and called her. Chambers has been an activist for the student athlete for several years. Some athletic officials characterize his efforts as unnecessary, but less than 2 years before the gymnast scholarships were revoked, the Nebraska faculty representative testified in front of the Nebraska Legislature that no athlete at Nebraska ever had lost a scholarship because of injury. During a hearing with the Committee on Education, January 24, 1984, James O'Hanlon, faculty representative, testified in the following manner. At the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, if an athlete is injured, he or she is continued on a grant and aid until eligibility is exhausted and or time of graduation. This bill, talking about mine, is consistent with what we do as practice, and in that sense, we're comfortable with it. But in that sense also, we're not sure it's needed. It clearly was not done in that fashion in this case, and had Chambers not intervened, nothing had been done. Neither the ladies nor their parents contacted me about the role I played, but that's the way it is. They don't need to contact me. My job is to do it, and I don't have to be thanked for it. Thanks was not a part of my pay, by the way. Now, here's something. There was a guy named Budge Porter who had broken his back, and while they were practicing or playing, they got a door from someplace, put him on that door, put him on the door in the back of a station wagon and took him to the hospital. I thought that was horrendous. His family had a devil of a time trying to pay the costs of his care and treatment. Once again, since this person had been performing work, I consider athletes workers, unpaid at the time, the university, the state, should pay whenever an athlete is injured. So here is the law that I got put on the books. The Board of Regents of the University of Nebraska shall establish an insurance program which provides coverage to student athletes for personal injuries or accidental death while participating in university-organized play or practice in an intercollegiate athletic event. Such insurance program shall include, but not be limited to, the following coverage. 1. All reasonable and necessary hospital, medical, and surgical service for a period of 6 years after the date of injury, up to a maximum amount of $1 million. 2. For any total disability lasting longer than 1 year from the date of injury and which prevents further participation by the student in intercollegiate athletics, a minimum annuity of $2,000 per month must be paid to the disabled person beginning 1 year after the date of injury and continuing thereafter during the period of total disability, but not beyond 6 years from the date of the injury. 3. For any permanent and total disability, a minimum annuity of $3,000 per month to be paid to the disabled person beginning 6 years after the date of injury and continuing thereafter during the period of total disability. 4. Any permanent, and it went on to deal with permanent partial disability, then for accidental death, or dismemberment while participating in the university activity. The plan shall provide for payment of a lump sum benefit in the minimum amount of $100,000. Such insurance program may include self-insurance, etc., etc. Now, it was obvious to me that these kind of protections were needed. But here I am, a black man, a young black man, from the ghetto, as they called it. We are supposed to be subhuman. Yet here I am, in a legislature with 48 white people, in a state where over 93% of the people are white, and not one of them thought it was necessary or appropriate to do the things that I immediately saw as being needed. As soon as something came to my attention, I would address it. And that's the way I conducted all of my affairs in the legislature. Nobody had to tell me. When I saw something wrong, I acted. That's what I agreed in my mind was going to be my responsibility when, at what they call the swearing in, I gave the affirmation that I would discharge the duties of that office to the best of my ability. Well, apparently, the best of my ability far exceeds that of the 48 other people, all of whom were white, and the problems that I was solving involved their children, their athletes, and so forth. Obviously, I had in mind the black football players at that school, but really, any athlete was like an employee. They had to work regular hours. They spent more hours outside the classroom than in the classroom. They had assigned duties. If they didn't perform them satisfactorily, they could be fired. Now, there were students, journalism students, who worked for the student newspaper. They received pay. And if they had the opportunity to do an internship with a newspaper, they could do that, and it wouldn't interfere with them being students. But a football player, because he was a cash cow, could not do anything that interfered with his ability to generate revenue for the university. This is an article that was written in 2013. It appeared in the Omaha World Herald. Chambers was on the money. Why am I talking about things that I did? Because I know more about them than anybody else. I'm more familiar with what I did than I am with what anybody else did. And nothing on this earth is so forlorn as a car that won't toot its own horn. This article appeared in the Omaha World Herald, 2013, quite a while ago, especially for some of you youngsters. But it's going to talk about something that occurred. Well, I'll read it. Listen to the wind as it changes direction. Quote, just as other students are paid for on-campus jobs, football players who labor in a hazardous occupation and produce huge revenue should be paid, unquote. Quote, as with many other business enterprises, more concern is shown for making money than for those who play the game. This is not a game. This is not an extracurricular activity. This is a cutthroat business. It's time to send a message to the NCAA, unquote. The winds of public opinion are changing when it comes to paying college football players, but these are not recent quotes. They were said in 1981, 1988, and 2003. The author of the quotes was State Senator Chambers of Omaha. Chambers tried to get the wind to change back then. The first quote was uttered 32 years ago. As of today, that would be 43 years ago. I was on the money 43 years ago. Remember 1981? Charles Stone held the office of Nebraska governor. Tom Osborne was in his 9th year in the office of Nebraska football coach. There were a handful of college football games on television and only on Saturday. Big-time coaches all made less than $100,000 a year. The NCAA spoke, and people sat up straight, not Chambers. In 1981, he proposed a bill in the Nebraska Legislature that would make NU football players state employees and pay them accordingly. He was called crazy, maverick, rebel, Don Quixote. He was the one who was supposed to be jousting with windmills. Excuse me. The nationally syndicated sports comic strip Tank McNamara poked fun at Chambers. They called him everything except visionary. Now look, listen, the winds are changing. This is what's being said 2013. The calls to overhaul NCAA rules and give athletes financial help are coming from all ends of the national media, including ESPN's Jay Bilas. On Wednesday, CBS Sports.com columnist Greg Doyle laid out his case in a piece entitled Time to Pay College Athletes. They were only 32 years late. Last month, the cover of Time magazine had a headline that read, "It's time to pay college athletes." Once upon a time, Chambers said that if college football players ever organized and revolted, the NCAA would change. Last Saturday, players at Georgia Tech and Georgia and Northwestern quarterback Kane Coulter all put APU, which stood for All Players United, on their uniforms. It was meant as a statement about the way the NCAA treats athletes. Lo and behold, NCAA President Mark Emmert said recently that while the NCAA was steadfast against paying athletes a salary, the group would revisit the idea of a stipend next spring. Money, but they wouldn't call it a salary. The revolution is coming. Something is coming. You can see it. You can feel it. That's what this writer, this is Tom Chattel, by the way, who still writes for the World Herald. On Tuesday, I went to see Chambers in his office at the state capitol. I went to see if those winds had found their way down the quiet first-floor hallway and past the hardwood door of the senator's office. They had, but in his office, Chambers was not gloating, smiling definitely. Quote, "I have that Time magazine around here somewhere," Chambers said. "I was glad to see that. I'm just glad that people who couldn't see it before are acknowledging it now, because I want what's best for the players. The discussion has turned the corner. You have very powerful mainstream critical advocates for it now. I was not powerful. I was not mainstream. I lacked all credibility. But every argument they're making now, I had laid it out in detail, and it is no more valid now than it was then. But some ideas just take a while to catch on," unquote. I told Chambers that after last Saturday's Nebraska football game, I saw a copy of the Pay the Players issue of Time on a table in the Players Lounge. He chuckled, but he wasn't surprised. 32 years ago, the topic was the same. That's how this began with Chambers, who got to know several Husker players, including I-back Jarvis Redwine. Quote, "Redwine was married," Chambers said. "He needed money beyond what he was getting from the scholarship. I told those guys then, you guys are just like slaves. You do all this hard work and the university gets everything." I said I was going to offer legislation that makes football players state employees because you have regular hours that you have to work, specific duties you must carry out, and if you don't do it to your boss's satisfaction, you can get fired, or in other words, lose your scholarship. That's how it started. Chambers and his words appeared in the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and the Chicago Tribune, among other media outlets, and I was also on, can't even think of his name, it'll come to me. But there was no revolution. Cable TV and talk radio were not nearly what they are today. And the NCAA had considerably more credibility then than it does now. It's in a fragile state. Very few media types were going to take on the NCAA, much less student athletes who were brought up in the system. The bill that Chambers offered failed in 1981. He tried again in 1988. He changed the language to avoid making players state employees, but wanted them to receive a stipend. It passed, but Governor Kay Orr vetoed it, supporting NU's stance against it. That's a lie. NU had said that the way the bill was drafted, they didn't have any opposition to it. If NU paid its football players, school officials said, they would be ruled ineligible. Ruled ineligible by the NCAA. Another attempt failed in 2003. Chambers forged on. Along the way, there were victories. He succeeded in getting the NCAA to pay the full Pell Grant money to athletes. He fought and won insurance for Nebraska athletes who suffer any personal injuries during university-related practices or events. He also fought and won a battle to prevent revoking an athlete's scholarship because of injury. Now, these things seem logical and reasonable, but at the time I came along, they were not even done. It's funny how quickly people will feel that something everybody was against, once it's done, is the thing to do. But this goes on to point out my seeing what others didn't see. There was also a copy of a letter to Chambers from former LSU basketball coach Dale Brown, who had won national championships in basketball, dated June 27, 1988, congratulating Chambers for his efforts, adding, "Keep up the fight, we shall overcome. Remember, evil flourishes because good men do nothing," unquote. And there were quotes from Chambers in various articles concerning a need for a super conference for schools that could afford to pay players to play each other. And now they're talking about such a conference. And you can see the Big Ten, it has more than 10 teams. There is no longer a Big 8. The Big 12 changes. Those schools that want to pay are forming these big conferences, and the little schools that can't pay, they can still play intramural football like the Ivy League schools. And there were quotes from Chambers in various articles about the super conference. Amazing. Didn't Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowsley strongly hint last summer of the formation of a Division IV so power schools could play by similar rules, including offering money? And that's what I had said all those years ago. I did see that article, Chambers said. I advocated a super conference. The teams that can pay will play. If you can't pay, don't play. Have intramural football be like the Ivy League schools. These games against schools like South Dakota State are almost criminal. I was always against the brutality of the game, the vicious hits that people applaud. The announcer says, "He cleaned his clock," which means rendered the other player unconscious. I never saw sport in that. The games against these smaller schools shouldn't be played, and Nebraska's playing some of them now. I always respected Oklahoma's Brian Bosworth. He said, "We always like to play Nebraska because we know we're picking on somebody our own size." He didn't want to play against these little schools that the administration scheduled to pad their record. Chambers said he never advocated a players' union or a widespread protest, but he is not surprised by the APU story years later. The man looks like a visionary, light years ahead of his time. That's Chambers. But he says none of that matters, and he says no credit is necessary. What matters is that a boulder he tried to push up the hill in 1981 is rolling downhill in 2013 at a rapid speed, and one word from Chambers sums it up all. Finally. And he wouldn't be surprised if the idea grew. I never thought I should do it. Chambers said. I thought it should be done legislatively by the adults who should care about these players. What I said was, if that day ever comes, the NCAA will be in trouble. If the players rebel, a way will be found to do this, and the NCAA and everybody who says there's no money for the players, they will combine to make sure these players get something, because the players are the meal ticket. They're the goose who lays the golden egg. Chambers has always been realistic about this, even back to 1981. He says education should mean something. He also says some athletes belong in college and some don't. His argument is that the scholarship is not enough. That was the point made by CBS Sports commentator Dora. And by the way, I was on Phil Donahue's show against the head of the NCAA and Michigan State's football coach, and an audience full of people who were against players being paid. But I was never intimidated by a crowd. I never needed a crowd. If I believed something, I would do it. And when I believed it, it was my responsibility. But anyway, I will let that go. Here was something that related to the mistreatment of female athletes, and most of them were white, just like the two that I helped get their scholarships back, the gymnasts. I put this resolution in. Whereas on March 1st, 1985, UNL opened the Hewitt Center for Student Athletes. Whereas the center was funded partly with private donations and partly with university money, and whereas the center is an integral part of the UNL Intercollegiate Athletic Program, and whereas the Hewitt Center is a combination restaurant, library for student athletes, open and available to male athletes in all sports, and whereas the Hewitt Center will be used as a recruiting tool, being open to prospective recruits and their parents, and whereas the Hewitt Center is equipped with top-of-the-line kitchen facilities and a highly competent culinary staff capable of preparing delicacies to delight the palate to a far greater degree than the poor quality, greasy fare available to female athletes in the dormitory dining halls. Whereas a bank of personal computers will be available to assist athletes with math skills and vocabulary. Whereas the UNL Athletic Department academic counselor Ursula Walsh described the Hewitt Center as, quote, a warm, pleasant, homey, quiet place where people would want to come and eat and study, unquote. That was in an Omaha World Herald article, April 8, 1885. Whereas female athletes at UNL, being excluded from the definition of people and student athlete, have been barred from use of the Hewitt Center, and whereas female athletes at UNL devote much time and effort to their respective sports and would benefit as much as male athletes from the warm, homey environment of Hewitt Center, and whereas female athletes, I went on like that. I offered that to the legislature. They adopted it, and here was an article in the NCAA News. The Nebraska Legislature, May 31st, adopted a resolution strongly disapproving of a male athlete-only training table and study hall at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. State Senator Ernest Chambers of Omaha sponsored the resolution, adopted on a 27-1 vote. The resolution called on the university to end the policy immediately. The Hewitt Center for Student Athletes opened March 1st and was financed partly with private donations and partly from some $400,000 from the 1984 Kickoff Classic, a nationally televised football game between Nebraska and Pennsylvania. The center, which has a kitchen and study hall, including a bank of personal computers, is open to male athletes only because of space limitations, university athletic officials said. Quote from Chambers, "This is gender-based discrimination. Why bar women from the facilities when it is open to any potential recruit and his family?" Chambers said Nebraska women athletes have demonstrated excellence with national rankings in softball, track, and volleyball and deserve more than poor quality, greasy fare available in dormitory dining halls. The athletic programs are a microcosm of the university community and reflects the values of the university. And there were other articles that were praising that resolution. And it's funny that the only black person in the legislature was the one doing all these things to help all the other people who needed it. And here was the letter from Louisiana State head basketball coach, Dale Brown. Bravo, oh, dear Ernest, bravo, bravo, bravo. Man, do I admire your tenacity, honesty, perseverance, and concern for what is right. Enclosed, you will find the address of some top media in America that I think you should send your June 20th, 1988 letter to the Honorable Robert Spire, and I know they would publish this nationally. Keep up the fight. We shall overcome. Remember, evil flourishes because good men do nothing. Your friend, Dale Brown. Now, here's what I'm interested in doing. Oh, and I also got a bill requiring the NCAA, whenever they were going to impose discipline, to follow all of the requirements of due process. The NCAA didn't want to do it. The World Herald thought they shouldn't do it. But I said to the legislators, if you pass this, other states will jump on it, and that's what they did. And after the time that I got that through, the Nebraska legislature and other states followed, the NCAA now must follow all the due process requirements. For example, the accused must be allowed to face the accuser. If a ruling is made that the accused wants to appeal, anybody involved with making that initial decision could be a part of that. In other words, it's very similar to what might happen in court. And I think from what I've read here will let you know that I see the kind of contradiction always in the society. A black person may be the only one in a white setting, but that black person is the one who leads the way. And you know why I think this is? At least in my case, I know why it is. Having been misused and mistreated, not for anything I did, but because of the way I was born, it made me sympathetic anyway to other people who were mistreated, not for anything they did, but because of their being weak, being unpopular, or on the outs. And people who were white had a tendency to mob. It was the white people who put together the Ku Klux Klan, where when to get one black man, they always went to take a mob. They wore disguises so they couldn't be seen. And this is what America has a lot of still going on. When you look at this current presidential race, you see the racism that Trump is appealing to. He has an idiot named J.D. Vance, who I think is going to sink Trump's ship, because this man is as close to being crazy as anybody outside of an institution. And speaking of that, I am going to be a write-in candidate for the 11th Legislative District. When I took my name off the ballot, I got so many calls from people. They were so disappointed, and they said I should not have done it, that I did a good job when I was there. I was needed. So I said, then I will launch a write-in campaign. But I'm not one to go out and beg people for anything. This program that I do here, I know doesn't reach that many people. But for those who do watch it, if you see people who are interested in voting for me, then on the ballot, there will be the name of Terrell McKinney, the only name for the 11th Legislative District, and then there's a line for a write-in, and that's for all these offices. You write the person's name in, and you put an X in the box next to that name, and that's what you've got to do. So if you want me back in the legislature, which a lot of people don't, they fear it, worse than the plague, worse than COVID, write my name in, and if I win, then we will have a good time, I assure you. And now, as I always end these little set twos, as said the canary, when he became aware that the door to the cage was open. I'm out of here.
You've been watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to leave suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This is an EWC Communications production.